Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Welcome to a new week of Highest Power, Church and State. I'm Rick Pidcock, and in our interview segment today, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Janet Kellogg Ray about vaccines and the latest in the measles outbreak. But for our first story today, the Secret Service shot an armed man near the White House on Sunday morning who refused to drop his weapon.
Midnight last night, Secret Service personnel encountered the individual's vehicle parked around near 17th and F Street Northwest. Short time later, they observed an individual on foot matching the description. As officers approached, the individual brandished a firearm, at which time an armed encounter ensued, and Secret Service personnel discharged their service weapons.
In the hours following the incident, many supporters of Trump were quick to post online that people on the left have mental illness and that liberals are trying to assassinate Trump. But just like what happened after the attempted assassination of Trump during his Pennsylvania rally on July 13th, 2024, that narrative doesn't at all appear to be what happened. Regarding the warning from the Manchester, Indiana police to the D.C. Metropolitan Police on March 8th, sources told CNN it was an emotionally disturbed 27-year-old man who was, quote, possibly trying to attempt suicide by cop. In our second story, Trump had dinner Saturday night with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and special government employee Elon Musk after reports of an explosive cabinet meeting on Thursday. According to the New York Times, Rubio has been privately furious with Musk since Doge dismantled U.S. aid. As they sat across from one another in that explosive meeting, Musk reportedly accused Rubio of firing nobody except for a member of Doge. But Rubio pointed to the 1,500 State Department buyouts and sarcastically asked if they counted as layoffs and if Musk would like Rubio to hire them back so he could fire them again. And the New York Times says Musk responded by telling Rubio he was, quote, good on TV. With approximately 20 people in the meeting, the word was bound to get out, but Trump doesn't want the media to ask about it.
Your cabinet meeting with Elon Musk and some clashes potentially between Secretary Rubio and Secretary
No
Duffy.
clash. I was there. You're just a troublemaker. And you're not supposed to be asking that question because we're talking about the World Cup. Elon gets along great with Marco, and they're both doing a fantastic job. There is no clash.
But Mr. President, bottom line,
Who are you with?
NBC.
Oh, no wonder. That's
Mr. President,
NBC.
who has more authority, Elon Musk or the cabinet secretaries?
Any other questions?
For our third story, Canada's Liberal Party has chosen Mark Carney to replace Justin Trudeau. While Trudeau will stay on as Canada's Prime Minister during the transition, Carney will lead the Liberals in their uphill battle against the Conservatives in the next federal elections, which will happen sometime before October, depending on when they are called. Carney has a background in finance. He was appointed as the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance in 2019. He was also the governor of the Bank of Canada in 2008 during the financial crisis. According to CNN, he highlighted his role in helping the government address its debt during the 2008 financial crisis and his role in navigating Britain's economy through Brexit. He also has some choice words for President Trump.
America is not Canada. And Canada never, ever will be part of America in any way, shape, or form. We didn't ask for this fight. We didn't ask for this fight. But Canadians are always ready when someone else drops the gloves. So the Americans, they should make no mistake, in trade as in hockey, Canada will win. And Donald Trump, as we know, has put, as the Prime Minister just said, unjustified tariffs on what we build, on what we sell, on how we make a living. He's attacking Canadian families, workers, and businesses, and we cannot let him succeed. A person who worships at the altar of Donald Trump will kneel before him, not stand up to him.
And now for our final story. One of the goals of Project 2025 and the hallmarks of Trump's second term so far has been Trump surrounding himself with loyalists rather than experts. One of the clearest examples of this is through Trump's nomination of RFK Jr. as the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services. Prior to his nomination, RFK Jr. said this:
"There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective."
He also said he was planning to give infectious disease a break.
"I'm going to go to NIH my first week, and I'm going to call all the division heads, and I'm going to call all the bureau chiefs, and I'm going to say, we're going to give drug development and infectious disease a break, a little bit of a break, for about 8 years."
Then during Trump's first cabinet meeting, when a reporter asked about a child who had died during a measles outbreak in Texas, Trump asked RFK Jr. to comment.
"There have been 4 measles outbreaks this year. In this country last year, there were 16. So it's not unusual. We have measles outbreaks every year."
We now have around 230 cases of the measles in Texas and New Mexico, spreading especially among communities that are against vaccinations. RFK Jr. has mostly responded by suggesting people take vitamin A, and that vaccination is a personal decision. Here with me to talk about this is Dr. Janet Kellogg-Ray, who teaches at the University of North Texas and is the author of The God of Monkey Science, People of Faith in a Modern Scientific World. Dr. Ray, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for asking me. I'm glad to be here.
Definitely. So I'd like to begin by asking a more basic question about why we can trust vaccines. Like, what kind of process do these vaccines go through in order to be deemed safe and effective? And how can we trust scientific consensus, especially when Big Pharma has so much invested financially into the drugs that are developed? I think that's a common thing people start to get, questions about because of all the money involved.
I think that's a great question, because I think one of the problems that we have as a culture is that there's not a general understanding of how science works. And I'm glad you brought up that term of consensus, because I think there's this idea that scientific consensus is like the science club meets and everybody raises their hands and they take a vote as to what science consensus is going to be. But in reality, consensus refers to the evidence. And so when we talk about scientific consensus about the safety and the efficacy of vaccines, we're not talking about the opinions of various scientists. We're actually talking about the consensus of data from studies, from empirical, quantitative data about the safety and the effectiveness of vaccines. And so the vaccines that are approved today in our country, the general childhood vaccines, flu vaccines, COVID vaccines, those sorts of things, those have gone through years of study, of testing. There's all sorts of different levels of testing before they're even offered to the public. Obviously laboratory and then animal models. And then there's different levels of testing with humans, clinical trials. And so a vaccine is not going to be released unless it has gone through years and protocols of trials, and that there is a consensus of the data, not consensus of people's opinions, but consensus of the data. And so obviously nothing is 100%. And so one thing this data looks at is the cost benefit, that kind of thing. And as far as the vaccines that are under question now, the typical childhood vaccines, the MMR vaccines, COVID vaccines, all of these have been found to be safe and effective according to the consensus of the evidence.
So how do you respond when people like RFK Jr. will say that more studies need to be done, like with the links between vaccines and autism, or when they'll bring out a doctor who questions consensus and they say, here's a scientific professional who doesn't agree with what everybody else is doing, and then it kind of makes us lay people feel anxious. Like, can we not trust scientific consensus? Do we need to start binge watching all these documentaries and reading all these articles that go way over our heads to try to find the truth ourselves? Do we just trust scientific consensus like we trust an airline pilot?
there's always going to be an outlier. There's always going to be someone that is going to stand against consensus. There's just no way around that. But what I am seeing, especially with the new advent of RFK Jr. Back in our public consciousness, something that has been a phenomenon, I think, in the last few years. And, just for lack of a better way of describing it, it almost seems to me like cultural Gnosticism, Gnosticism of the religious Gnosticism in the first and second century, when people felt like they had this special knowledge that no one else had. And I'm seeing that especially with this topic of vaccines, in that there are those that claim to have this understanding and knowledge that sits far outside of the consensus of scientific data, of scientific evidence. And for some reason, that seems to be comforting to some people, that they feel like they have this special knowledge. And, that's just a cultural thing that I think we need to address, why this is so attractive to us, to have this knowledge, to have this one person who stands against what everybody else is saying, what all the vaccine experts are saying, what the vast majority of medical professionals are saying. We may need to evaluate why we are drawn to this special knowledge, to have this information that most of the public doesn't have. And the whole thing with vaccine and autism, you're probably aware, it goes back to the 1990s. A physician in England published an article in a prestigious journal, and this doctor, Andrew Wakefield, published a study that said that there was a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. What most people probably do not realize is that this study was done with 12 children, 12 children only. They were done with children that he volunteered from his son's birthday party, that said he would give them a 5-pound note if he would let them draw blood on him. So all of a sudden, we've got lots and lots of red flags. You have a small sample size. You don't have control of your study. You have questionably ethical selection of your test subjects. And at the same time, Dr. Wakefield had a patent filed for his own personal MMR vaccine. And so all of this came out after the fact, but unfortunately, the damage was done and is still being done. So that original study was fraudulent. Wakefield lost his medical license. The study was revoked, rescinded, but there are still people that will bring Wakefield in to speak to their parent groups because of the fear of some of these childhood vaccines. But I just think our overall picture is to step back and look at it and say, are we listening to voices that are complete outliers, or are we listening to the consensus of scientific data? And I'll just say one other thing. I think there's this idea that there's this secret cabal of scientists that are trying to hide information from you. It's the cure that they don't want you to know about. With COVID pandemic, we saw a lot of this alternative treatments that the mysterious they didn't want you to know about. But that's absolutely not how science works. Anyone who is been a bench scientist or is familiar with how researchers work know that scientists just love to prove each other wrong. And so there is not going to be a big, if there was a problem with these childhood vaccines, it would be not a secret. It wouldn't be just one person who said, I think there's a problem with it. Scientists love to prove each other wrong. That's how science works. It's called peer review. And peer review is ultimately what showed the original Wakefield studies to be fraudulent, because for decades after Wakefield published his studies, other scientists across the world in many different laboratories tried to replicate his findings, and nobody could. And so it wasn't like, that everyone was going to get behind this one scientist and prop him up no matter what. People were showing him to be wrong, and they weren't afraid to do so.
That's helpful. So, when RFK Jr. says he wants to take a break from focusing on infectious diseases for like 8 years, just 8 years, what kind of effect would that have on our public health?
I think we're already seeing it, Rick. I've been, as you can imagine, keeping up with the news and following some of these science communicating websites. And already what we are seeing are some of our major universities that are rescinding research offers to new scientists coming into the field. They aren't going to have the funding to support their research. And so some of our major research institutions are rescinding offers. Institutions like the National Institutions of Health, which is our primary American source for healthcare research, has been tremendously scaled back. They've had across the board firings. And now with RFK saying that he's going to put infectious disease on the back burner, it's extremely disconcerting for that. And what's more disconcerting is seeing the public applause for that in some areas, and putting a pause on it. Again, I think people don't understand what treatments for disease, treatments, vaccines, the processes that they have to go to. So when you stop this, you're stopping what usually is years and years of clinical trials. And so by stopping it at the headwaters here, we're not just putting ourselves off for 8 years, we're putting ourselves off for much longer than that.
Yeah. I know that Christians have had a rocky relationship with a lot of this, with scientific consensus on a lot of different topics.
Mhm.
But why do you think Christians today seem particularly skeptical of scientific consensus?
I think what we are seeing is the fallout of decades of telling Christians that scientists and science cannot be trusted. I mean, think back to the 1980s when the culture wars really started going and private schools started propping up Christian schools for lots of reasons. But one of the primary reasons we saw this uptake is teaching of the science of evolution in public schools. And so for decades, since at least the 70s and 80s, Christians, especially those in evangelical quarters, have been told that scientists are lying to them, literally lying to them about evolution, that scientists are hiding evidence for special creation, or scientists are hiding evidence for the age of the earth. And so for decades, we've been told that scientists are lying about these areas of science. And so what we're seeing is the fallout of that. If scientists are going to lie to us about evolution, and scientists just want us to be atheists like they are, so they've made up evolution. I love when I hear that one. They made up evolution because they don't want to be accountable to God, and they don't want anybody else to believe in God either. So for decades of hearing this message from pulpits, from documentaries, from literature, is it any wonder that has bled over into a mistrust of science and scientists in other areas? If they're going to lie to us about the age of the earth, maybe they're lying to us about this COVID virus thing. If they want us to trust scientists when it comes to evolution, but scientists are atheists, why should we trust you? Why shouldn't we have faith over fear when it comes to measles, or faith over fear when it comes to COVID? So I think what we're seeing is a fallout of sowing mistrust in science for decades.
So how can we begin to help Christians disentangle some of these fears and these even like culture war concerns from science so that they can learn to like just be free to trust scientific consensus and love their neighbors in that way?
Well, what we've got to understand is that from a perspective of as a person of faith, which I am, if God is truth and all truth is God's truth, then what do we have to fear from what science tells us? I've come to the point in my life that nothing in science is going to scare me. It's just, I'm understanding more about the natural world. Science is the tool that we use to do that. And so, why should we be afraid of truth if God is truth? And if all truth is God's truth, then we should approach it with open eyes and open minds. And, because people of faith in a modern world are going to have to use science to love their neighbors well, for the flourishing of the world, whether it's vaccines, whether it's taking care of our climate. Science tells us ways that we can increase the flourishing of our world. And, again, it's some of the most vulnerable that are hurt when people of faith reject science. This is not a fun stat, but for example, by far, white evangelicals resisted COVID vaccinations more than any other demographic. By far, it was white evangelicals resisting vaccination. And you have to ask yourself, how long was the COVID pandemic, for example? How long did it go on when it didn't have to be? Because evangelicals were resisting vaccinations. With our current measles outbreak, how much of it is due to people like a pastor right here in my area? Just this weekend in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, my where I'm from, there was a pastor that got lots of press this weekend because the private school associated with his megachurch has the lowest vaccination rates in the state of Texas. And what he said was, shout out. I'm so proud of you. A state representative said, I'm so excited about this. I'm sorry that we haven't celebrated this school sooner. So what you have is a megachurch celebrating the fact that they have the lowest vaccination rates for their school. It's only at 14% in the state of Texas, while we are in the midst of one of the largest measles outbreaks in decades. But yet we have churches celebrating the fact that they aren't vaccinated. So we've got to understand that disconnect there, that what we're choosing to do as people of faith is having real world consequences on our neighbors and our communities.
Well, this has been really helpful. Dr. A, I thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I thought what Dr. Ray said about Gnosticism was especially helpful. Of all the descriptors that come to mind about the authoritarian Christian nationalist movement in charge of the United States today, one that stands out to me is the lack of humility in thinking one or two people know more than the consensus of experts studying real data. Rather than patiently waiting for professionally trained investigators to release their findings, they jump to conclusions based on a culture war, just like Trump did weeks ago when he blamed the D.C. plane crash immediately on DEI. Rather than appointing highly qualified people to lead the government departments, Trump picks the likes of RFK Jr. and then has Elon Musk and his band of 20-year-olds start going to town telling the secretaries what to do. And sure, Biden nominated Pete Buttigieg to transportation secretary despite Buttigieg's lack of experience. But at least Buttigieg wasn't calling into question scientific consensus and acting like he knew something nobody else did. Our obsession with obtaining the highest power has real-world consequences that not only wounds people spiritually, but leads to the spread of pandemics and infectious diseases. And if we're going to heal these wounds, we're going to have to start with having some humility. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and share, and we'll be back on Thursday with the latest.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.